Let's review the ANCA's pro-Artsakh advocacy. In this presentation, we'll talk about the work that we do for Artsakh, but just as importantly, we'll discuss how we talk about Artsakh here in Washington, D.C., how we frame the Artsakh issue in our engagement with the executive branch and Congress. To start, it's important to understand that Artsakh is an important part of our 360-degree advocacy agenda, an agenda that includes justice for the Armenian genocide, security for Artsakh, and stronger U.S.-Armenian relations. Our efforts in all of these areas are certainly very diverse, but they are all aligned with our North Star, which is the security and long-term viability of a free, independent Armenian homeland. So let's jump right in. The political battles that we fight for Artsakh here in Washington, D.C. are fought on many fronts. The trenches and front lines of the struggle stretch across our nation's capital, which is why it is so essential that we're clear about our mission and that we articulate with great specificity the policies that we are petitioning our government to adopt. The ANCA's Artsakh mission statement is as simple as it is straightforward. I'd like to share it with you word for word. The ANCA seeks to generate increased U.S. support in principle, policy, and practice for the security and prosperity of the independent Artsakh Republic, challenging Azerbaijan's aggression, strengthening U.S. Artsakh ties, appropriating direct U.S. humanitarian assistance, and supporting the OSCE Minsk Group as a platform to reach a durable, democratic, and peaceful resolution of Artsakh-Azerbaijan status and security issues. You can read this mission statement, as well as our current policy objectives and our record of results, via the link on this screen. Our most urgent Artsakh priority is countering Azerbaijan's aggression, preventing a renewed war. We do that by alerting the Congress and the executive branch to Azerbaijan's reckless escalation, its war games, and its cross-border attacks. But we also advance this agenda in the policy world by seeking to prevent arms sales, arms transfers, military assistance to the government of Azerbaijan. We do that by defending Section 907, which imposes statutory restrictions on assistance to Baku, but also by advancing new initiatives like the Sherman Amendment, which prohibits the use of any U.S. hardware, any U.S. military equipment by Azerbaijan in acting out its terrible threat to shoot down civilian airliners operating out of Stepanakert Airport. And of course, we're pressing the administration to abandon its policy of false parity, that artificial even-handedness that answers every Azerbaijani attack with a generic call on both sides to refrain from violence. Also, a very high ANC priority is ensuring continued U.S. humanitarian aid to Artsakh. Since 1998, more than $40 million has been provided to the people of Artsakh by the U.S. taxpayer. That assistance has provided maternal health care, clean drinking water, and has cleared vast areas of Artsakh of landmines and unexploded ordnance, saving countless lives. Unfortunately, though, that humanitarian aid program is under attack by Azerbaijan and its allies here in Washington, D.C. They are going after it very aggressively, and we are fighting back just as hard. Thankfully, the intent of Congress is clear. In the last 3 years, the U.S. House has passed 2 amendments, the Valadeo Amendment in 2017 and the Cox Amendment in 2019, appropriating assistance for this purpose. Over the past 2 years, over 130 members of Congress, the representatives and senators, have joined together in signing 4 different letters defending this aid program, so that there's a clear bipartisan constituency that wants this assistance to continue. That is opposed, unfortunately, by the executive branch, which is trying to kill this program. If the program is killed, ultimately, landmines will be left in the ground, and many citizens of Artsakh and the surrounding region who are in desperate need of rehabilitation services will not find the care that they so desperately need. The ANC is devoted to stronger U.S.-Artsakh relations. We're committed to countering Azerbaijan's efforts to isolate Artsakh, which is why we work so hard to deepen, to broaden the engagement and cooperation between Artsakh and the United States. That takes the form of congressional delegations to Stepanakert, and we've seen several over the last few years, and also high-level official delegations from Artsakh to Washington, D.C. We think dialogue advances the cause of peace and advances U.S. interests in the region. The main legislative vehicle to advance this noble aim is HRS 190, which was introduced by Congressman Frank Pallone and would remove artificial, counterproductive barriers to the type of dialogue that only makes sense if we're really committed to peace in this region. And in cooperation with the ANCA Eastern Region and the ANCA Western Region, we're looking to add to the 9 states that have already formally recognized Artsakh's independence: California, Colorado, Georgia, Hawaii, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Maine, Michigan, and Rhode Island. A vital element of the ANCA's pro-Artsakh advocacy is our opposition to the Madrid Principles, a reckless plan that front-loads all the risks on Artsakh and all the rewards on Azerbaijan. A little later in this presentation, I'll go into great detail about why we think this is an unfair and ultimately unenforceable plan. But there is something I do want to make very clear. The US State Department has announced that preparing populations for peace is now a national priority for the US government. We say that that should be done in an even-handed manner. It is simply unfair for the US, through its arms of public diplomacy, to operate in the free and open Armenian media environment and lecture Armenians about what they must concede, and then in Azerbaijan's very closed and repressive media environment, walk on eggshells to make sure that they don't upset Ilham Aliyev's tender sensitivities. That's simply not fair, and it's not something that we will ever accept. The ANCA's position paper on the Madrid Principles, which includes a detailed review of the reasons for our opposition to this plan, can be found at anca.org/Madrid. If you'd like to weigh in with your members of Congress and the administration against this proposal, go to anca.org/rejectmadrid. While we oppose the Madrid Principles, we strongly support the OSCE and Minsk Group as a sensible, sustainable platform for resolving status and security issues between Artsakh and Azerbaijan. We look to the US government to play a stronger role within the Minsk Group and also to help strengthen the 1994 ceasefire and to promote stability along the line of contact. And that starts with implementing the Royce Angle peace proposals. The Royce Angle peace proposal represents the region's best path forward, its best hope for peace. One of the 2 authors of this bipartisan plan, Ed Royce, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he said, "Absent accountability, there can be no peace." He was right. These are common sense proposals: to withdraw snipers, heavy arms, and new weaponry from the line of contact, to add international observers, and to deploy gunfire locators so that international monitors can know who is starting the aggression, who is crossing the line of contact. Armenia, Artsakh, the US, and the OSCE are all in favor of the Royce Angle proposals. Only Azerbaijan stands against them, and that is precisely because they don't want accountability. We worked very hard last year for the passage of the True Amendment, a bipartisan endorsement of the provisions of the Royce Angle peace proposal. What members of Congress understand very well is that without peace on the ground, we're not going to see progress at the peace table. What the parties need to do, all the parties, including Artsakh, is to sit down together on a horizontal basis and work toward a durable, democratic, packaged solution that addresses in a fair manner the outstanding security and status issues between Artsakh and Azerbaijan. Those are the key elements of the ANC advocacy agenda. What I'd like to do now is turn to how we talk about Artsakh, how we frame the Artsakh issue here in Washington, D.C. Let me say at the outset that it's essential that we present the history and the legal dimension of the Artsakh issue in as accurate and intelligent manner as we possibly can. But my topic today is not history and it's not the law. It's more the political presentation of the Artsakh issue in the policy-driven context of Washington, D.C. Let's start by speaking about Artsakh in American terms, which is easy because Artsakh is a very American story, the victory of a free people over foreign rule. Artsakh's freedom is founded on the same principles in our own Declaration of Independence, that the just powers of government are derived from the consent of the governed. By Baku's logic, the American colonies would still be part of the British Empire. Really, as Americans, we need to take our cues on democracy from George Washington, not King George III. We need to remember that our founding fathers didn't sign a declaration of interim status. They didn't compromise on freedom. They signed and stood by a Declaration of Independence. We can also look at Artsakh from the other side, from the Soviet perspective. When we do, we see that Azerbaijan's only claim to Artsakh is that Joseph Stalin, a Soviet dictator, stole it for them. That's clearly not a moral or a legal defense. The fact of the matter is that Artsakh has never been part of an independent Azerbaijan. We can also explain in more universal terms that the United Nations, which started after the Second World War with less than 50 members, today has more than 190 member states. That's because of decolonization, that's because of democracy, and that's because of self-determination. Why should Artsakh be the exception to this rule? We can also speak in universal terms about the danger that Azerbaijan represents to the world, risking a regional war amid a global pandemic with potentially catastrophic consequences for the international community. And it's also worth pointing out that Azerbaijan is one of only a handful of countries to have rejected the United Nations call for a global ceasefire during the COVID-19 pandemic. In speaking about Artsakh in humanitarian terms, it's important to point out that nobody wants peace more than the Armenians. Read the history, look at the maps, study the numbers. It's obvious Armenians want peace, but it needs to be a durable peace. And to reach that peace, they need a partner. They need a partner for peace, not an Azerbaijan that is hell-bent on its destruction. It's also important for us to point out that we mourn every death. Each one on either side is a terrible tragedy, but ultimately, these soldiers, these citizens, are victims of Ilham Aliyev's reckless ambition to subjugate a free people to his foreign rule. Perhaps the most terrible example of Azerbaijani efforts to incite anti-Armenian hatred is the case of Ronald Safarov. He is an Azerbaijani officer who murdered an Armenian officer as he slept with an axe during a NATO training exercise in Budapest, Hungary. The Azerbaijani government organized his release. He was delivered to Baku, where he was pardoned by Ilham Aliyev. He was given a parade and a promotion and all of his back pay and turned into a national hero for the terrible act of murdering an Armenian in his sleep. That's the message, sadly, that Azerbaijan is sending to its citizens and especially to its next generation. In terms of social justice, Azerbaijan openly places restrictions on visitors based only upon their ethnic identity. Armenians are simply not welcome in Azerbaijan. That type of discrimination is the very definition of racism. In security terms, the anti-Armenian pogroms, the massacres of the late 1980s and early 1990s in Baku and Sumgait and other cities across Azerbaijan proved beyond doubt that Armenians can never live in safety under Azerbaijani sovereignty. In democratic terms, it's essential to draw the contrast between Azerbaijan on the one hand and Armenia and Artsakh on the other. Armenia and Artsakh have held free and fair elections, while Azerbaijan is a hereditary petromonarchy run by the Aliyev family like a personal ATM machine. Let's be very clear on this point. And Aliyev has run Azerbaijan for nearly every single one of the last 50 years. The current president, Ilham, was handpicked by his father, Haidar. Ilham then chose his own wife as his vice president, and by all accounts, they're grooming their son to be the next leader of the country. The OSCE, which is supposed to be an honest broker, is quick to criticize Artsakh's free and fair elections, but never seems able to find the courage to call out Azerbaijan for holding fake elections. The bottom line of democracy is that the citizens of Artsakh, having survived Soviet tyranny, having overcome Azerbaijani aggression, having stood up a flourishing democracy, deserve the same rights that we cherish as Americans. In terms of religious liberty, we should always point out that Artsakh is an early cradle of Christianity, with holy sites dating back to the 1st century. In the context of religious freedom, it's also worth asking why, in light of all the terrible suffering visited upon Christians and other religious minorities across the region over the past several years, why anybody would want to risk placing this Christian Armenian population of Artsakh under a hostile Azerbaijani government. The contrast on issues of religious freedom could not be more stark. Armenia and Artsakh fully respect the rights of religious minorities, while Azerbaijan just got recommended for a special watch list for countries that severely violate freedom of faith. Perhaps the most telling example of Azerbaijan's religious intolerance was its wholesale destruction of the Armenian cemetery in Julfa, Nakhichevan. The Azerbaijani military raised thousands upon thousands of intricately carved Armenian crosses. These are called khachkars in Armenian. They push them into the river, crumble them to dust, and deny that crime until this very day. We should frame the Artsakh issue in post-conflict terms, focusing on the fact that Artsakh is a country, not a conflict. Artsakh has made remarkable progress under the most difficult of circumstances. If they graded countries on a curve, Artsakh will get an A+ across the board. The conflict narrative is driven by Aliyev and his determination to destroy and depopulate Artsakh. That's why he's raising the stakes, escalating his aggression, even during a global pandemic. We can also present the Artsakh issue in Aliyev's own terms. He has made no secret of the fact that he aims to conquer Artsakh, then to move on to Zangezur, Sunik, the southern region of Armenia, and ultimately to claim Azerbaijani control over Yerevan, the Armenian capital, which he calls the Yerevan Khaganate. So he has made no secret of his ambitions, and it's very clear from his own words that while Yerevan wants peace, it's Baku that wants Yerevan. It's clear from Aliyev's own words that he wants an Armenia without Artsakh, precisely so we can have an Artsakh without Armenians. In presenting the Artsakh issue in Washington, especially in the national security environment, there's no more powerful messaging than the Royce angle peace proposals. The Armenian side, Artsakh and Armenia, have endorsed these peace proposals. The US and OSCE back them as well. It's only Azerbaijan that is against the withdrawal of snipers, the addition of observers, and the deployment of gunfire locators. It's very important to point out that it's the Armenian side that is pro-peace, that wants to strengthen the ceasefire, to promote stability at the line of contact, yet it's Azerbaijan that stands in the way of that very progress. It's clear that without peace on the ground, without a strong ceasefire, without stability at the line of contact, we're not going to see progress at the peace table. The first test, the most urgent test of which side is committed to peace, is the Royce angle peace proposal. We need to ask ourselves, who is in favor of adding observers? Who is in favor of deploying gunfire locators? Who wants to see the snipers withdrawn from the line of contact? In each case, it's the Armenian side, Armenian Artsakh, that are taking the constructive stand, the pro-peace stand, and it's Azerbaijan that is standing in the way of progress. And finally, we need to speak about Artsakh in practical terms, which brings us to the Madrid Principles. These principles call upon the Armenian side, call upon Artsakh to make upfront, irrevocable strategic concessions of land and security in return for vague and entirely reversible promises from Azerbaijan about possible future status for Artsakh at some point down the road. At its heart, this is a deeply flawed, phased plan that sets back the cause of peace, places lives at risk, and actually increases the chances of renewed war. Our criticism of the Madrid Principles fall into three basic categories. Number one, they're not fair, not in the least. Number two, they're fake. Azerbaijan is walking them back even before they're signed. And number three, the provisions are entirely unenforceable. Let me walk you through each of these three reservations. Number one is the easiest. The terms of this deal are unfair. On its face, the idea of asking one side to surrender territory, its sovereign soil, its security, in return for a vague promise of status, a promise that can easily be revoked or disowned down the road, the terms are grossly unfair. Our second reservation is that this is not a real deal at all. In fact, it's fake. Azerbaijan is walking back its terms, withdrawing its concessions before it has even signed an agreement. President Aliyev makes it clear all the time that the only destiny for Artsakh is to be under Azerbaijani sovereignty. The Azerbaijani ambassador here in Washington wrote an op-ed recently in which he said that the Armenian side would surrender territory, and in return, would not be independence, would not be self-determination for Artsakh, but rather, in his terms, a security guarantee for both the Azerbaijani and Armenian communities of the Artsakh region of Azerbaijan. So what he's basically offering is nothing. He's saying that Azerbaijan, having fought, having lost a war, would get the land that it desires, and in return, it would give to the Armenians even less than they had before that war, even less than they had under Soviet tyranny. That's obviously a fake deal, and on its surface, obviously not one that the Armenians can accept. And finally, on top of this being an unfair deal, grossly unfair, on top of it being fake, entirely fake, is the fact that it is unenforceable. And that's because of the way that the settlement is phased. All the things that Azerbaijan wants, Azerbaijan gets on day one. The things that Armenia would like to see get deferred to some undetermined point in the future. So you have a situation in which, if this is the agreement that is reached, you would have Azerbaijan holding land and the Armenian side holding a piece of paper. And that's simply not a viable solution, certainly not one that the Armenian nation will accept. For such an unfair, fake, and unenforceable deal to work, to conceivably work, would require that Azerbaijan respond in good faith to Artsakh's upfront surrender of territory, something we have never seen and something we have no reason to expect. For it to work, the international community would need to step up in the form of peacekeepers, to step in to protect the Armenian people, to protect the citizens of Artsakh, to challenge Azerbaijani aggression. That's something we've never seen and something we have no reason to expect. What history teaches us is, in fact, just the opposite. That Baku is much more likely to consolidate any advantages it secures through such a deal, and while the world looks on, to leverage those gains to secure additional territory, starting with Zangezur, Sunik, the southern part of Armenia, and ending with Aliyev's often stated ambition of reclaiming Azerbaijan's lost Yerevan Khanate, the capital of Armenia, Yerevan. It's worth pointing out in this regard that the last time Turkey and Azerbaijan held joint war games, their soldiers wore on their sleeves a badge featuring a map that essentially erased Armenia. I'll close today by suggesting a number of useful rhetorical questions that can help bring greater clarity to the Artsakh issue. For example, you might ask a diplomat who's pushing the Madrid Principles whether he or she would sign over the title to their home in return for the type of vague promises that Azerbaijan is giving Artsakh. Another question we can ask is, why would Armenians, having sacrificed thousands of lives to save Artsakh, give to Azerbaijan that which Azerbaijan failed to conquer on the battlefield? Why would we accept servitude worse than we had under the Soviets after having beaten back Azerbaijan on the battlefield? In historical terms, we should ask whether Turkey is any less hostile toward Armenians by virtue of having stolen Western Armenia, or, for that matter, whether Azerbaijan is less violent toward Armenians by virtue of having gotten Nakhichevan. And finally, two last questions. The first, after centuries of massacres, of conquests, of territorial losses, why should we believe that losing more land will somehow make us more secure? And the last question, my personal favorite, does anyone actually believe that more land will make Azerbaijan less hostile, or that less land will make Artsakh more secure? I'll repeat that question. Does anyone actually believe that more land will make Azerbaijan less hostile, or that less land will make Artsakh more secure? An important question, one we should ask ourselves and everyone else. Thanks for joining with me today. Thank you.